You need to move back to economy where you belong. Those words would destroy everything Patricia Whitmore thought she knew about power privilege and the price of prejudice. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how a single airplane seat became the catalyst for a reckoning that would reshape an entire industry, we need to start where this story really begins, in the marble-clad halls of Greenwich, Connecticut's most exclusive social circles. The alarm in the Whitmore mansion chimed softly at 5:30 a.m., though Patricia had been awake for 20 minutes mentally rehearsing the day's agenda. At 52, she moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone who believed every detail of her presentation mattered, from the platinum blonde highlights that cost more than most people's monthly salary to the way she held her coffee cup with just enough delicacy to remind everyone watching that she had been raised properly, meaning with money. Lots of it. And the unshakable conviction that this made her better than people who hadn't been. Her reflection stared back from the bathroom mirror that had been imported from Italy, showing a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of looking expensively maintained. Every wrinkle had been erased through procedures that cost thousands. Every strand of hair had been positioned to catch light in the most flattering way, and every piece of clothing had been selected to announce her status before she even opened her mouth. Patricia Whitmore didn't just wear designer labels, she embodied them, becoming a walking advertisement for the kind of lifestyle that required stepping on other people to maintain. The morning newspaper lay folded beside her breakfast, but Patricia rarely read beyond the society pages where her name appeared regularly in connection with charity events that she attended, more for the networking opportunities than any genuine desire to help people. Today's agenda included a final fitting for the dress she would wear to the Royal Ascot, followed by lunch with the Greenwich Garden Gala Committee, where she would finalize arrangements for an event that existed primarily to remind everyone of her social standing. Robert emerged from his study looking haggard, the weight of secrets that Patricia couldn't see etching deeper lines around his eyes with each passing day. At 55, he had built his reputation as a corporate lawyer who could make problems disappear for the right price, but lately the problems had been getting bigger while the prices had been getting harder to justify. His offshore accounts, carefully hidden for years, had become a source of growing anxiety as federal regulations tightened and audits became more sophisticated. "The car will be here in 30 minutes, Patricia announced, not looking up from her phone where she was scrolling through Instagram, checking the engagement on her latest post about their anniversary trip to London. She had crafted the caption carefully, emphasizing their decades of marriage and their commitment to celebrating life's special moments, though anyone who knew them well understood that their relationship had become more business partnership than romance years ago. Patricia's treatment of their household staff revealed everything about her character that her carefully curated social media presence tried to hide. She spoke to Maria, their housekeeper, with the kind of casual cruelty that came naturally to people who had never questioned their right to treat others as servants. When Maria asked about vacation time to visit her family in El Salvador, Patricia's response was swift and cutting, a reminder that jobs like hers were easy to fill, and that gratitude should be expressed through silence and subservience. The drive to JFK International Airport showcased Patricia's worldview in miniature as she criticized other drivers for their lack of consideration, while simultaneously demanding that their driver speed through traffic to ensure they arrived exactly when she wanted. Her platinum medallion status with the airline was more than just a travel perk. It was a symbol of her place in the world's hierarchy, a tangible reminder that some people deserved better treatment because they could afford to pay for it. As they approached the airport, Patricia reviewed her mental checklist for the day, which included making sure the flight attendants understood her dietary restrictions, ensuring that her carry-on bag was stowed in the premium overhead compartments, and settling into her preferred seat with the window view that she considered her right rather than a privilege. She had no way of knowing that within hours her entire understanding of rights and privileges would be challenged by a woman whose quiet dignity would expose every ugly assumption Patricia had spent her life making. The first-class cabin of Flight 847 hummed with the quiet efficiency that Patricia Whitmore had come to expect from her premium travel experience, where every surface gleamed with careful attention and every passenger was treated like royalty, or at least like someone whose money had purchased the right to be treated that way. The burgundy leather seats were positioned with mathematical precision to provide maximum comfort and privacy, while the soft lighting created an atmosphere of exclusive tranquility that justified the thousands of dollars that first-class tickets demanded. Patricia moved through the boarding process with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned about her right to be anywhere, flashing her platinum medallion card like a badge of superiority and expecting the gate agents to recognize not just her status with the airline, but her place in the broader social hierarchy that she believed governed all human interactions. Her Louis Vuitton carry-on bag was heavier than airline regulations technically allowed, but Patricia had learned that rules were suggestions when you had the right connections and the willingness to make scenes that cost companies more than simply looking the other way. Seat 1. A was occupied by Dr. Amelia Washington. Though Patricia saw only a black woman in an impeccably tailored cream-colored suit, who appeared to be reading documents that looked far too official for someone who Patricia assumed had probably upgraded using points or employee benefits. The woman's presence in the premium cabin immediately triggered Patricia's internal alarm system, the one that had been calibrated over decades of believing that certain spaces belonged to certain people and that deviations from this natural order represented either mistakes or intrusions that needed to be corrected. Dr. Washington's posture spoke of quiet confidence and professional authority qualities that Patricia recognized but interpreted through the lens of her own prejudices as inappropriate presumption or calculated performance, designed to make other passengers uncomfortable. The documents spread across Dr. Washington's tray table bore official seals and classifications that would have impressed anyone who understood their significance, but Patricia saw only papers that seemed designed to create an impression of importance that she believed was unearned and undeserved. "Excuse me." Patricia began, her voice carrying the particular tone that she had perfected over years of getting her way through a combination of politeness and barely concealed threat. "I believe there's been some confusion about seating arrangements, and I'm hoping we can resolve this quickly and quietly so that everyone can enjoy their flight without unnecessary drama or complications." The smile that accompanied Patricia's words was the kind that had served her well in country club disputes and charity committee meetings, sweet enough to provide plausible deniability while sharp enough to cut through any resistance she might encounter. She had learned early in life that people responded better to suggestions wrapped in courtesy than demands delivered with obvious hostility, though the underlying message remained the same regardless of how it was packaged. Dr. Washington looked up from her reading with the calm attention of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations with grace and professionalism. Her dark eyes assessing Patricia, not with hostility, but with the kind of careful observation that comes from years of recognizing patterns in human behavior. She folded her documents carefully, giving Patricia the courtesy of her full attention, while maintaining the composed demeanor that had served her well in courtrooms where far more was at stake than airplane seating arrangements. "Good morning, Dr. Washington," replied her voice, carrying the kind of educated precision that suggested extensive training in communication and conflict resolution. "I'm not aware of any confusion regarding my seat assignment, but I'm certainly willing to listen if you believe there's been some kind of error that needs to be addressed." Patricia's frustration began to build as she realized that the subtle pressure she had expected to resolve the situation immediately wasn't working the way it usually did when she encountered people who understood their place in the social hierarchy. The woman's polite attention felt like resistance, and her obvious intelligence seemed like a challenge to Patricia's assumption that this situation could be handled quickly and quietly without attracting the attention of other passengers who might interfere with her plans. "Well, the thing is," Patricia continued, her voice beginning to carry the edge that appeared whenever her initial approach failed to produce immediate compliance, "my husband and I are celebrating our anniversary, and I specifically requested seats together so that we could enjoy this special trip as a couple. But it seems like there's been some kind of mix-up with the reservations that's created this unfortunate situation." The lie came easily because Patricia had been practicing variations of it for years, using fabricated medical conditions, imaginary anniversaries, and fictional emergencies to justify her demands for preferential treatment. She had discovered that people were more likely to accommodate requests when they believed genuine hardship was involved, and she had become expert at manufacturing sympathy for problems that existed only in her imagination. Dr. Washington's expression remained professionally neutral as she absorbed Patricia's explanation, though a careful observer might have noticed the slight pause that indicated she was choosing her words with particular care. "Congratulations on your anniversary," she said, her tone warm enough to seem genuine, while maintaining the boundaries that her experience had taught her were necessary when dealing with people whose requests might not be as innocent as they appeared. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin began to shift as other passengers became aware that something unusual was happening in row 1, where the conversation between Patricia and Dr. Washington had moved beyond the polite preliminaries that usually characterized interactions between strangers and into territory that made everyone within earshot uncomfortable. Patricia's voice had begun to carry the sharp edge that she usually reserved for household staff and customer service representatives who failed to understand the urgency of her needs, while Dr. Washington maintained the calm professionalism that had served her well in far more challenging situations than dealing with an entitled passenger who couldn't accept that her demands weren't going to be automatically fulfilled. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're asking me to do." Dr. Washington said her words, chosen with the precision that came from years of navigating conversations where every syllable could have significant consequences. "My seat assignment is correct according to my boarding pass, and I have important work to complete during this flight that requires the privacy and space that this particular seat provides." Patricia's face flushed with the kind of anger that erupted when people who were supposed to defer to her authority instead chose to assert their own rights, creating situations that challenged her fundamental understanding of how the world was supposed to work. She had learned to expect compliance from people she encountered in service positions, and when that compliance wasn't immediately forthcoming, her first instinct was to escalate the pressure until resistance became too uncomfortable to maintain. "Look," Patricia said, her voice dropping to the kind of whisper that was actually louder than normal speaking volume, and designed to ensure that everyone nearby could hear her words, while maintaining the pretense of discretion. "I don't think you understand how serious this is for me, and I'm trying to be reasonable about finding a solution that works for everyone, but you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be." The arrival of Kevin Martinez, the senior flight attendant, provided Patricia with the opportunity she had been waiting for to involve someone with authority who could resolve this situation in her favor without requiring her to continue negotiating with someone who clearly didn't understand the rules of social hierarchy that should have governed their interaction. Kevin had worked in premium cabin service for 8 years, long enough to recognize the signs of escalating passenger conflicts, and experienced enough to know that his next words would determine whether this situation could be resolved quietly or would explode into something that could affect the entire flight. "Is everything all right here?" Kevin asked, his trained smile masking the anxiety he felt whenever passengers began having disputes that could attract the attention of social media and airline management. "I want to make sure both of our valued passengers are comfortable and that we can address any concerns before we begin our departure procedures." Patricia immediately seized the opportunity to present her case to someone she assumed would naturally side with a Platinum Medallion member over someone she believed had probably upgraded using points or employee benefits. There seems to be some confusion about seating arrangements. She explained, her voice taking on the reasonable tone that she used when she wanted to appear fair and accommodating, while actually demanding that other people sacrifice their comfort for hers. At that moment, the boarding process brought an unexpected addition to the situation when 8-year-old Emma Washington appeared at the front of the cabin escorted by another flight attendant who was helping her navigate the busy aisles with her small rolling suitcase. Emma moved with the careful precision that came from extensive travel experience, but her young age and obvious excitement about the flight created a striking contrast to the tension that had been building between the adults in row 1. Aunt Amelia Emma called out with the unguarded joy that only children could express, her face lighting up as she recognized her aunt sitting in the window seat. "I found you. The nice lady helped me get through the big crowd of people, and I remembered that you said you'd be in the very front seat by the window, so I could find you easily." The arrival of Emma transformed the dynamic of the entire situation, because her presence made it impossible for Patricia to continue treating Dr. Washington as an abstract problem to be solved, rather than a real person with family connections and human relationships. Children had a way of cutting through pretense and revealing the essential humanity in situations where adults had forgotten to see each other as complete human beings, deserving of respect and consideration. Patricia's assumptions about Dr. Washington's presence in first class became even more entrenched as she watched the interaction between aunt and niece, because in her worldview, children traveling in premium cabins represented either indulgent parents spending beyond their means, or some kind of charity or upgrade situation that confirmed her belief that certain people didn't belong in spaces reserved for those who could afford to pay full price for their privileges. "Who is this little girl?" Patricia asked her question, directed toward Kevin, rather than Dr. Washington, as if the presence of a child in first class required explanation and justification rather than simple acceptance. "I wasn't told that there would be unaccompanied minors in this section, and I need to know if this is going to affect the quiet atmosphere that I paid premium prices to enjoy." Emma looked up at Patricia with the kind of direct curiosity that made adults uncomfortable when they were harboring thoughts that wouldn't sound good if spoken aloud to a child. "Hi," she said, with the friendly openness that hadn't yet been trained out of her by years of adult social conditioning. "I'm Emma, and I'm flying to London with my Aunt Amelia to see the museums, and maybe the place where the Queen lives if we have time." The innocence of Emma's response highlighted the ugliness of Patricia's suspicions in a way that made other passengers uncomfortable as they began to understand what was really happening in the conversation they had been overhearing. Children had a way of exposing adult prejudice simply by existing naturally in spaces where their presence challenged assumptions about who belonged where and why. Patricia's decision to document what she perceived as an injustice revealed the dangerous intersection of social media and prejudice, where personal grievances could be amplified into public spectacles without regard for truth or consequences. She retrieved her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to weaponize documentation, believing that recording her complaints would provide evidence of the poor treatment she was receiving and generate sympathy from her social media followers who shared her worldview about appropriate behavior and proper places for different kinds of people. "I cannot believe the lack of customer service I'm experiencing on this flight," Patricia announced to her phone's camera, holding it at an angle that captured Dr. Washington's profile while focusing primarily on her own face to emphasize her role as the victim in this narrative. "I am a Platinum Medallion member celebrating my anniversary, and I am being forced to sit in an uncomfortable seat because someone who clearly doesn't understand first-class etiquette is refusing to accommodate a reasonable request." The live stream began attracting viewers immediately drawn by Patricia's hashtags about poor airline service and discrimination against paying customers. Though the discrimination she imagined was quite different from the discrimination that was actually taking place in real time, as hundreds of people watched a privileged woman attempt to force a black passenger out of her assigned seat. Social media had created new opportunities for public humiliation, but it had also created new opportunities for people to expose themselves in ways they didn't intend or understand. Dr. Washington continued reading her documents with apparent composure, though anyone trained to recognize the signs of controlled tension would have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes and the deliberate precision of her movements as she maintained her professional demeanor, despite being recorded without permission and characterized as disruptive for the crime of occupying her assigned seat while black. Sarah Kim, a flight attendant with 6 years of experience in customer service and conflict resolution, approached the situation with the kind of diplomatic caution that came from training in handling passenger disputes that could escalate into legal and social media nightmares for airlines that depended on public goodwill and positive reviews. She had recognized Dr. Washington immediately upon boarding, though her professional training required her to treat all passengers with equal respect, regardless of their fame or social standing. Mrs. Whitmore Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from extensive training in de-escalation techniques. "I understand that you have concerns about your seating arrangement, but I want to assure you that all passengers in this cabin have valid first-class tickets and assigned seats that were confirmed through our reservation system." Patricia's frustration exploded into open hostility as she realized that the flight crew was not automatically siding with her complaints, creating a situation where her expectations of preferential treatment were being challenged by people whose job she believed included ensuring her complete satisfaction, regardless of how unreasonable her demands might be. "This is ridiculous," Patricia exclaimed, her voice carrying clearly throughout the cabin and attracting the attention of passengers who had been trying to mind their own business but found it impossible to ignore the escalating drama in row 1. "I am being discriminated against by your staff and by this passenger who is clearly here on some kind of charity ticket or upgrade that shouldn't entitle her to take seats away from paying customers." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, revealing the ugly assumptions that had been driving Patricia's behavior from the moment she had seen Dr. Washington in seat 1A and decided that something was wrong with the picture. The other passengers in first class shifted uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing explicit racism being performed for a social media audience that was growing larger by the minute. Dr. Washington slowly closed her folder of documents and removed her reading glasses. Movements that seemed casual but actually represented a calculated decision to engage more directly with a situation that had moved beyond the point where it could be resolved through polite disengagement. When she looked directly at Patricia for the first time since the confrontation had begun, her eyes carried the weight of someone who had faced similar challenges countless times and developed strategies for responding that protected both her dignity and her safety. "Mrs. Whitmore, Doctor," Washington said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the cabin stop whatever they were doing and pay attention to what was about to happen. "I believe you may want to reconsider your approach to this situation before it becomes something that you cannot control or undo." The warning was delivered with such calm precision that it felt more ominous than if it had been shouted, because it suggested that Dr. Washington understood exactly what was happening and had the knowledge and resources to respond in ways that Patricia couldn't anticipate or prepare for. The balance of power in the cabin had begun to shift, though Patricia was too focused on her own grievances to recognize the danger she was creating for herself. Captain Michael Torres received word of the situation through the cabin crew communication system, and his 20-year career in commercial aviation had taught him to take passenger conflicts seriously, especially when they involved accusations of discrimination that could result in federal investigations and significant legal exposure for the airline. The decision to involve the captain indicated that the situation had escalated beyond normal customer service protocols and into territory that required careful documentation and potential law enforcement involvement. The viral explosion that followed Patricia's live stream revealed the terrifying speed with which modern technology could transform private moments into global spectacles, amplifying personal conflicts until they became cultural events that attracted millions of viewers and generated consequences that extended far beyond the original participants. Within the first hour of Patricia's broadcast going live, the hashtag first class Patricia had begun trending across multiple social media platforms as viewers shared their reactions to what they had witnessed and began investigating the identities of the people involved in the confrontation. The Internet's collective detective work operated with frightening efficiency as anonymous users combined facial recognition technology, public record searches, and social media mining to identify both Patricia Whitmore and Dr. Amelia Washington, creating detailed dossiers that revealed not just their names and professional backgrounds, but their entire life histories, family connections, and patterns of behavior that had previously been private information. The democratization of investigation tools had created new forms of accountability, but it had also created new vulnerabilities for people whose mistakes could be magnified into career-ending scandals within hours of being recorded. Dr. Washington's identity as a federal circuit court judge and prominent civil rights advocate transformed the narrative from a simple customer service dispute into a story about racial profiling and institutional prejudice that resonated with millions of people who had experienced similar treatment in airports, restaurants, and other public spaces where their presence was questioned based solely on their appearance. The revelation that Patricia had demanded that one of the most respected jurists in America move to economy class because she didn't belong in first class created a level of public outrage that surprised even experienced social media observers who thought they had seen every possible variation of viral content. The backlash against Patricia began immediately as users discovered her history of problematic social media posts, her involvement in Greenwich social organizations that had faced previous discrimination complaints, and her pattern of treating service workers with casual cruelty that had been documented in online reviews and employee complaints that suddenly seemed relevant to understanding her character. The Internet had created new forms of justice that operated outside traditional legal structures, and Patricia was about to learn that social media could be both weapon and punishment for people whose behavior violated community standards about basic human decency. Robert Whitmore's phone began buzzing with calls from colleagues, clients, and partners who had seen the viral video and understood immediately that his wife's public meltdown could have serious consequences for his legal practice and the corporate relationships that had taken decades to build. The modern business environment demanded careful attention to public image and social responsibility, and companies that associated with people involved in discrimination scandals often found themselves facing boycotts and protests that could damage their bottom line and reputation. The law firm where Robert worked as a senior partner had spent years building relationships with pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, and financial institutions that were increasingly sensitive to public relations disasters that could affect their stock prices and customer loyalty. The partners held an emergency conference call to discuss the potential impact of Patricia's viral moment on their client relationships and their firm's reputation, because modern corporate clients expected their legal representation to come from firms that maintained impeccable public images and avoided controversial associations. Ashley Whitmore, Patricia's 24-year-old daughter who worked in marketing for a sustainable fashion startup in Brooklyn, watched her carefully cultivated professional network disintegrate in real time as colleagues and friends distanced themselves from anyone connected to the woman who had become the Internet's latest symbol of entitled racism. Her Instagram account, which had featured lifestyle content about ethical consumption and social justice themes, suddenly seemed hypocritical as followers discovered her family connection to the viral villain who had epitomized everything wrong with privileged white women who believed their comfort was more important than other people's dignity. The Greenwich social establishment that had been Patricia's primary source of identity and validation began the delicate process of excommunicating someone whose behavior had brought negative attention to communities that prided themselves on maintaining appearances and avoiding public scandals. Country club memberships, charity committee positions, and social event invitations evaporated as organizations realized that association with Patricia could damage their own reputations and funding sources, because modern philanthropy required careful attention to the personal conduct of high-profile supporters who could become liabilities overnight. Dr. Washington's measured response to media requests demonstrated the kind of professional grace that had made her a respected figure in legal and civil rights circles, as she declined to provide inflammatory quotes while acknowledging the broader patterns of discrimination that made Patricia's behavior significant, beyond the personal insult it represented. Her statement focused on the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, while noting that incidents like this one revealed ongoing challenges in creating truly inclusive environments where everyone could participate fully in public life without having their presence questioned or challenged. The corporate response to Patricia's viral moment illustrated the way modern businesses had learned to distance themselves quickly from public relations disasters that could affect their brand reputation and customer loyalty. As companies that had previously valued Robert's legal services began questioning whether continued association with his family would create more problems than it solved. The pharmaceutical giant that provided 40% of his firm's annual revenue sent a carefully worded email expressing concern about recent events and requesting immediate clarification about the firm's position on diversity and inclusion issues, language that experienced attorneys recognized as the beginning of client relationship termination procedures. Partnership meetings at Whitmore and Associates took on the grim atmosphere of crisis management sessions, as senior lawyers discussed the potential impact of Patricia's behavior on their ability to attract and retain clients who increasingly demanded that their professional service providers demonstrate commitment to social responsibility and ethical conduct. The legal industry had become more competitive and image-conscious over the past decade, and firms that found themselves associated with discrimination scandals often struggled to maintain their market position and reputation among potential clients who had multiple options for representation. Robert's carefully constructed offshore financial structure began attracting federal attention as investigators followed the digital trail that Patricia's viral moment had created, because social media scandals often triggered broader examinations of public figures who found themselves under scrutiny for any behavior that might suggest patterns of problematic conduct. The Internal Revenue Service and Treasury Department had sophisticated algorithms designed to identify financial arrangements that warranted closer examination, and people who attracted negative public attention often discovered that their privacy and financial affairs were no longer protected from government investigation. The audit process revealed layers of financial misconduct that Robert had managed to hide for years through complex international banking arrangements and shell corporations that had allowed him to avoid paying taxes on income that should have been reported to federal authorities. His insider trading activities, conducted through offshore accounts that he believed were invisible to domestic law enforcement, became evidence in a criminal investigation that threatened not just his professional license but his personal freedom and financial security. Ashley Whitmore found herself unemployed within 48 hours of her mother's viral moment as her employer decided that association with the Whitmore family had become incompatible with their company's values and brand identity, particularly given their customer base of socially conscious consumers who expected the companies they supported to maintain ethical standards that extended to employee-family connections. The modern economy had created new forms of collective punishment where individual misconduct could affect entire families and social networks, as people discovered that their relatives' behavior could have consequences for their own career prospects and social standing. The cascade of professional and social consequences demonstrated the interconnected nature of modern reputation management, where individual actions could trigger institutional responses that affected multiple generations and extended family networks in ways that previous eras of limited communication and slower information sharing had never made possible. Patricia's moment of airport entitlement had created a chain reaction that was destroying decades of relationship building and financial planning that had seemed secure just days earlier. Greenwich social organizations that had previously competed for Patricia's involvement and financial contributions began the process of removing her from leadership positions and membership roles because association with viral discrimination scandals could affect their own fundraising capabilities and social standing among wealthy donors who had multiple philanthropic options and preferred to support organizations that maintained pristine public images. The country club where Patricia had spent her weekends for 15 years sent a formal letter requesting her resignation from the membership committee and suspending her facility privileges, pending a review of conduct policies that had been updated specifically to address social media controversies that could reflect poorly on the club's reputation and values. The modern social establishment had developed zero-tolerance policies for behavior that could attract negative media attention regardless of where that behavior occurred, or whether it technically violated any written rules about member conduct. Dr. Washington's access to federal investigation resources allowed her to conduct the kind of comprehensive background research that revealed the true scope of Patricia's pattern of discriminatory behavior and the financial crimes that had funded her lifestyle of entitled privilege, creating a detailed picture of someone whose viral airport moment was actually the inevitable result of years of believing that rules and social norms didn't apply to people with enough money to buy their way out of consequences. The investigation revealed that Patricia's treatment of service workers, minorities, and anyone she perceived as lower in social status had been documented in numerous complaints, lawsuits, and incidents that painted a picture of persistent bigotry enabled by wealth and social position. The Federal Financial Crimes Unit discovered that Robert's offshore banking arrangements were connected to a broader network of tax avoidance schemes and money laundering operations that had been under surveillance for months as part of an ongoing investigation into corporate corruption and international financial crimes. Patricia's viral moment had inadvertently exposed her family to law enforcement attention that might have taken years to develop through traditional investigative methods, because social media scandals often triggered enhanced scrutiny that revealed criminal activity that had been previously hidden. The documentary evidence of Patricia's discrimination included employment tribunal records from former household staff who had filed complaints about verbal abuse, racial slurs, and wrongful termination based on ethnic background and immigration status, creating a legal paper trail that demonstrated her pattern of treating people differently based on their perceived social status and racial identity. The non-disclosure agreements that had been used to silence previous victims became evidence of deliberate attempts to hide discriminatory behavior that violated federal civil rights statutes and employment law. Background checks revealed Patricia's history of using her wealth and social connections to avoid consequences for behavior that would have resulted in serious legal problems for people without her advantages, including multiple incidents of drunk driving that had been dismissed through expensive legal representation and charitable contributions that influenced judicial outcomes. The pattern suggested that Patricia had learned to view legal and social rules as suggestions that could be ignored by people with sufficient resources to manage the consequences. Investigation into Robert's client relationships revealed connections to companies that were under federal scrutiny for various forms of corporate misconduct, including price-fixing schemes, environmental violations, and fraudulent business practices that had cost consumers and taxpayers millions of dollars. His legal practice had specialized in helping corporations minimize their exposure to regulatory oversight and criminal prosecution, using techniques that bordered on obstruction of justice and conspiracy to defraud the government. The offshore financial accounts contained evidence of insider trading activities that had generated millions in illegal profits through advanced knowledge of corporate mergers, government contract awards, and regulatory decisions that Robert had learned about through his client relationships and professional network. The sophisticated nature of the financial crimes suggested coordination with international criminal organizations that specialized in hiding assets from law enforcement and tax authorities. Federal prosecutors began building cases that could result in decades of prison time for financial crimes that had been ongoing for years but had only been discovered because Patricia's viral discrimination moment had triggered the kind of public attention that made comprehensive investigation both possible and politically necessary. The irony that her moment of racist entitlement had exposed far more serious criminal behavior illustrated the unexpected ways that social media accountability could reveal broader patterns of misconduct that traditional law enforcement had failed to detect. The investigation expanded to include other members of Patricia's social network who had been involved in similar financial arrangements and discriminatory practices, creating a web of accountability that extended far beyond the original airplane incident, but had been made possible by the public attention that her viral moment had generated. The arrival of Flight 847 at London Heathrow Airport marked the beginning of Patricia's transformation from entitled passenger to international criminal suspect as British authorities implemented protocols that had been developed for handling Americans who committed crimes while traveling and faced potential extradition proceedings that could result in prosecution in multiple jurisdictions. The London Metropolitan Police had coordinated with federal law enforcement agencies to ensure that Patricia's arrest would be conducted according to international legal standards that protected both British sovereignty and American constitutional rights, while making clear that her viral behavior had triggered serious criminal charges that extended far beyond airline customer service disputes. Patricia's disbelief at seeing uniformed officers waiting at the gate reflected her inability to understand that her actions had consequences that extended beyond social embarrassment and temporary inconvenience because her lifetime of privilege had insulated her from any serious accountability for behavior that would have resulted in immediate arrest and prosecution if committed by someone without her social advantages. The reality that British authorities were treating her as a criminal suspect rather than an important American citizen who deserved special consideration shattered her fundamental assumptions about how the world was supposed to work for people like her. The charges related to filming classified documents without authorization and violating aviation security protocols that were designed to protect sensitive government information from foreign surveillance and terrorist activities because Dr. Washington's judicial documents contained confidential details about ongoing federal investigations that could compromise national security if they were shared with unauthorized individuals or hostile foreign governments. Patricia's live stream had inadvertently broadcast classified material to thousands of viewers around the world, creating the kind of security breach that federal authorities treated as potential espionage, regardless of the perpetrator's intentions or political affiliations. Robert's decision to abandon his wife at Heathrow Airport demonstrated the collapse of their marriage and his desperate attempt to salvage something from the personal and professional destruction that her viral moment had triggered, as he chose self-preservation over loyalty to someone whose behavior had threatened everything they had built together over 3 decades of married life. His flight back to New York represented not just physical abandonment, but emotional and legal abandonment as he began cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced criminal charges and the possibility of avoiding prison time for his financial crimes. The extradition proceedings required Patricia to remain in British custody while American and British legal authorities negotiated the complex international law issues that arose when viral social media incidents triggered criminal investigations that crossed multiple jurisdictions and involved both domestic and foreign legal systems. The process could take months or years to resolve, depending on the complexity of the charges and the willingness of both governments to cooperate in prosecuting someone whose crimes were primarily financial and reputational rather than violent or threatening to public safety. Patricia's first experience with international criminal justice revealed the vast difference between American detention facilities and British police procedures, as she discovered that her wealth and social status provided no protection from the reality of being treated as a suspected criminal who had violated laws that both countries took seriously, regardless of her personal circumstances or family connections. The comfortable assumptions about legal representation and bail procedures that governed American criminal justice didn't apply in British custody, where different rules and cultural expectations created additional layers of anxiety and uncertainty about her future. The media circus surrounding Patricia's arrest demonstrated the global reach of social media accountability as British tabloids, American television networks, and international news organizations competed to provide the most comprehensive coverage of someone who had become a symbol of entitled American racism that resonated with audiences around the world who had experienced similar treatment from privileged tourists who expected deference and special treatment in foreign countries. Dr. Washington's dignified exit from the aircraft provided a stark contrast to Patricia's humiliation as she was escorted away in handcuffs, because the difference between their respective treatment by authorities illustrated the way that character and reputation could influence how people were perceived and treated, even in situations where legal procedures were supposed to ensure equal treatment regardless of social status or personal background. 6 months after Flight 847 landed at Heathrow, Patricia Whitmore stood in the checkout line of a discount grocery store in Yonkers, counting crumpled bills to pay for items that would have seemed beneath her notice during her previous life of unlimited credit cards and personal shopping services that delivered everything she needed without requiring her to interact with retail workers or consider the cost of basic necessities. The transformation from Greenwich socialite to struggling single woman had been swift and merciless, as every support system that had sustained her privileged lifestyle disappeared once the full scope of her family's criminal behavior became public knowledge, and their assets were seized by federal authorities. The divorce proceedings had been particularly brutal because Robert had testified against her in exchange for a reduced prison sentence, claiming that Patricia had been aware of his financial crimes and had actively participated in spending money that had been obtained through tax evasion and insider trading schemes. His betrayal had been both strategic and personal, as he chose to portray their marriage as a criminal conspiracy rather than a partnership between two people who had made different choices about how to respond when their comfortable life began to unravel under legal scrutiny. Patricia's daily existence had become a grinding struggle with realities that she had never been forced to confront during her decades of married comfort, as she discovered that survival without family money required skills and endurance that her privileged upbringing had never taught her to develop. Her minimum wage job as a dental receptionist provided barely enough income to cover rent on a studio apartment that would have fit inside the walk-in closet of her former Greenwich mansion, and every month brought new challenges related to budgeting transportation and basic survival that highlighted how little she understood about the lives of working people she had previously dismissed as unimportant. The social isolation was perhaps more devastating than the financial hardship, because Patricia had built her entire identity around relationships and activities that required wealth and status to maintain, and without those resources, she discovered that she had no genuine friendships or interests that could survive the collapse of her artificial social world. The Greenwich community that had once competed for her attention now treated her as a cautionary tale and source of embarrassment that needed to be forgotten as quickly as possible to preserve the reputation of organizations and individuals who couldn't afford to be associated with criminal behavior and viral racism. Ashley's estrangement from her mother had been both protective and punitive as she struggled to rebuild her own career and social relationships, while distancing herself from family scandals that continued to generate negative publicity and professional consequences for anyone connected to the Whitmore name. The decision to change her surname and move across the country represented both practical necessity and emotional rejection of a family history that had become too toxic to acknowledge or defend in professional and social situations. Patricia's attempts to maintain some version of her former lifestyle had failed spectacularly as she discovered that luxury services and exclusive venues were no longer available to someone whose credit was destroyed and whose reputation made her unwelcome in establishments that catered to wealthy clientele who expected privacy and discretion from their service providers. The humiliation of being recognized in public places by people who had seen her viral meltdown created a form of social imprisonment that made ordinary activities like grocery shopping or medical appointments into exercises in public shame and anxiety. The prescription medications that had previously managed her anxiety and depression became unaffordable luxuries that her new insurance wouldn't cover and her limited income couldn't support, forcing her to confront mental health challenges without the pharmaceutical assistance that had made her previous lifestyle bearable despite its underlying emptiness and moral bankruptcy. The psychological impact of losing everything simultaneously had created trauma symptoms that she couldn't afford to treat professionally, leading to a downward spiral that affected her ability to maintain employment and housing stability. The criminal restitution requirements meant that any financial recovery would be impossible for decades as the federal government seized any income above basic survival needs to compensate victims of Robert's financial crimes and pay penalties that had been assessed against their family assets. The legal system had created a form of permanent economic punishment that would prevent her from ever returning to anything resembling her former lifestyle, regardless of how successfully she might rebuild her career or personal relationships in the future. The number 47 bus route through the Bronx had become Patricia's primary connection to the outside world, a mobile classroom where she encountered the humanity and dignity of people whose existence she had previously ignored or dismissed as irrelevant to her comfortable life in Greenwich's protected enclaves. The daily commute to her job at the dental clinic required 45 minutes each way, on crowded public transportation that forced her into contact with working families, elderly immigrants, and struggling students who demonstrated forms of grace and mutual support that she had never learned to recognize or appreciate during her years of private car service and first-class travel. The irony of her dependence on public transportation was not lost on Patricia, as she remembered her complaints about airline seating and her demands for premium treatment that now seemed grotesquely entitled when compared to the daily challenges faced by people who couldn't afford cars or taxi service but maintained their dignity and courtesy despite economic hardship that made her current struggles seem manageable by comparison. The bus riders who shared space with her demonstrated the kind of basic human decency that she had failed to show toward Dr. Washington and countless other people whose only crime had been existing in spaces where Patricia believed they didn't belong. On this particular November morning, as cold rain streaked the bus windows and Patricia clutched a prepaid phone that she had purchased at a convenience store, because her credit wouldn't support a traditional cellular contract. She opened a news application that had become her primary source of information about the world beyond her immediate survival concerns. The headline that appeared on her screen created a physical reaction that felt like being punched in the stomach as she read that Dr. Amelia Washington had been nominated to serve as the next Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The accompanying photograph showed Dr. Washington standing in the Rose Garden beside the President of the United States wearing the same cream-colored suit that she had worn on Flight 847, but now surrounded by the symbols of American power and justice that represented the pinnacle of legal achievement and social recognition. The image captured everything that Patricia had tried to diminish through her airport tantrum, as Dr. Washington's composed smile and dignified posture illustrated the kind of character and accomplishment that deserved respect, regardless of race or any other characteristic that prejudiced people used to justify their discriminatory behavior. Reading about Dr. Washington's extraordinary career and her decades of commitment to civil rights advocacy revealed the magnitude of Patricia's error in assuming that appearance could predict worth or that social status could be determined through superficial observation and racist stereotyping. The woman she had tried to move to economy class had prosecuted hate crimes, defended voting rights, and worked to ensure equal treatment under law for people who faced exactly the kind of discrimination that Patricia had performed for her social media audience, without understanding the broader implications of her behavior. The bus lurched to a stop in front of a community center where a group of teenagers was waiting to board their backpacks and school uniforms, indicating that they were students traveling to or from educational activities that required public transportation because their families couldn't afford private alternatives. Patricia watched as they filed onto the crowded bus, with the kind of mutual consideration and quiet courtesy that she had never shown toward flight attendants, hotel staff, or restaurant workers who had provided service that she had treated as her right rather than their professional courtesy. A 16-year-old black student with gentle eyes and worn sneakers noticed Patricia struggling to maintain her balance as the bus accelerated, and without being asked or acknowledging their previous interaction, he stood up from his seat and gestured for her to take his place. The simple gesture of kindness from someone who had no obligation to help her and no knowledge of her viral history created an emotional response that Patricia wasn't prepared to handle, as she realized that this stranger was treating her with more consideration than she had shown toward Dr. Washington, despite their vast differences in social status and personal accomplishment. "Thank you," Patricia managed to whisper, though the words felt inadequate to express her gratitude for kindness that she didn't deserve and hadn't earned through her own behavior toward people who looked like this thoughtful teenager. As she settled into the seat that he had given up for her comfort, she understood for the first time that dignity wasn't something that could be purchased or claimed through social position, but something that was demonstrated through how people treated each other regardless of their circumstances or backgrounds. The remainder of the bus ride passed in contemplative silence as Patricia absorbed the contrast between the teenager's spontaneous generosity and her own calculated cruelty toward someone whose only offense had been occupying a seat that Patricia wanted for herself. The viral video that had destroyed her life suddenly seemed less like unfair punishment and more like inevitable consequence of behavior that violated basic principles of human decency that this young man understood, despite his obvious economic disadvantages and her former wealth and social advantages. The decision to write to Dr. Washington came after weeks of internal struggle, as Patricia confronted the reality that her viral moment had caused genuine harm to someone who had done nothing to deserve public humiliation and racist attack, and that meaningful accountability required more than private regret or self-pity about the consequences that her behavior had triggered for her own life and family. The letter-writing process forced her to examine her motivations honestly and acknowledge that her desire to make contact with Dr. Washington was motivated by genuine remorse rather than strategic calculation designed to improve her public image or reduce the social and legal consequences of her actions. Patricia purchased a box of simple stationery at a discount store and spent hours crafting drafts that moved beyond apology into territory that required acknowledging the specific ways that her behavior had reinforced harmful stereotypes and contributed to the broader patterns of discrimination that made air travel and public accommodations uncomfortable or hostile for people whose presence was questioned based on their appearance rather than their legitimate right to occupy space that they had paid to access. The final version of her letter avoided the self-serving language that had characterized her previous attempts to explain or minimize her airport behavior, and instead focused on accepting full responsibility for choices that had caused harm while acknowledging that understanding the impact of her actions was an ongoing process rather than a single moment of enlightenment that could erase the damage that had been done through years of treating people differently based on racist assumptions about their worth and social status. Dear Dr. Washington, the letter began. I am writing to acknowledge that my behavior toward you on Flight 847 was wrong, harmful, and inexcusable, regardless of the personal stress or social pressures that I might claim influenced my actions that day. I understand that my demand for you to move seats was based entirely on racist assumptions about your right to be in first class, and that my subsequent social media posts and comments to other passengers created a public spectacle that subjected you to scrutiny and criticism that you did nothing to deserve and should never have been forced to endure. The letter continued with detailed acknowledgement of the specific ways that Patricia's behavior had reflected broader patterns of discrimination that affected not just Dr. Washington personally, but countless other people who faced similar challenges when their presence in professional, educational, or social spaces was questioned by people who believed that racial identity could predict social status, economic circumstances, or personal worth. Patricia wrote about her growing understanding that individual acts of prejudice contributed to larger systems of exclusion and marginalization that made ordinary activities like air travel into exercises in proving worthiness and defending dignity that white passengers never had to consider or experience. The most difficult section of the letter involved acknowledging that Patricia's viral moment had exposed Dr. Washington to death threats, harassment, and invasion of privacy from internet trolls who had used her personal information to target her family and professional colleagues with racist abuse that continued for months after the original incident had faded from mainstream news coverage. The recognition that her airport tantrum had triggered ongoing victimization of someone whose only crime had been existing while black, in a space that Patricia considered her exclusive domain, created a level of responsibility that she was only beginning to understand and accept. Patricia also wrote about the ways that her behavior had potentially affected Emma, the 8-year-old girl whose excitement about traveling to London with her aunt had been overshadowed by witnessing adult racism that could have lasting psychological impact on a child's understanding of her place in the world and her right to feel safe and welcome in public spaces. The recognition that her actions had traumatized a child forced Patricia to confront the generational impact of discrimination and the ways that individual prejudice could affect young people's development and self-worth in ways that extended far beyond the immediate incident. The letter concluded with a commitment to ongoing accountability work that wasn't designed to earn forgiveness or reduce consequences, but rather to ensure that Patricia's understanding of racism and her responsibility to combat it would continue developing through education, volunteer service, and support for organizations that worked to create more inclusive and equitable communities where people like Dr. Washington and Emma could exist without having their dignity challenged by strangers who believed that appearance could determine worth or belonging. Patricia mailed the letter without expecting or requesting a response because she understood that Dr. Washington had no obligation to engage with someone who had caused her harm, and that genuine accountability required accepting that forgiveness was something that couldn't be demanded or negotiated but only offered freely by people who had been wronged if and when they chose to extend that grace to someone who had violated their basic human dignity through prejudiced behavior. Patricia's volunteer work at the Bronx Community Kitchen began as court-mandated community service, but evolved into something deeper as she discovered that serving meals to homeless families and elderly immigrants provided opportunities to practice the kind of basic human consideration that she had failed to demonstrate during her years of privilege and entitlement. The work was physically demanding and emotionally challenging, because it required her to interact with people whose life circumstances forced her to confront the arbitrary nature of economic security and social status that she had previously taken for granted as permanent features of her identity rather than temporary advantages that could disappear without warning. The diversity training programs that Patricia eventually began facilitating represented a form of public penance that required her to share her story of viral racism with corporate audiences who were often skeptical of her transformation and suspicious of her motivations for speaking about discrimination and implicit bias. The hostile reception that she received from human resources professionals and sensitivity training participants provided constant reminders that accountability was an ongoing process rather than a single event, and that earning credibility after public disgrace required consistent demonstration of changed behavior over extended periods of time. The most challenging aspect of her speaking engagements involved responding to questions from audience members who had experienced workplace discrimination and wanted to understand how someone like Patricia could develop genuine awareness of bias and prejudice after spending decades treating people differently based on their race, ethnicity, and perceived social status. These conversations required her to acknowledge the privilege and ignorance that had enabled her discriminatory behavior, while avoiding self-pity or defensiveness that would have undermined the educational value of sharing her experience as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked prejudice. Patricia's relationship with Emma Washington developed slowly through supervised visits that were initially arranged through the restorative justice program that Dr. Washington had agreed to participate in as part of her commitment to transforming individual accountability into broader social change. Emma's maturity and wisdom, remarkable for someone so young, challenged Patricia to examine her behavior through the eyes of a child who had witnessed adult racism and needed to understand how people could choose to change their attitudes and actions when confronted with evidence of their harmful impact on others. The conversations with Emma often focused on questions about fairness, kindness, and the ways that adults sometimes made mistakes that hurt other people's feelings and violated principles of equal treatment that children learned in school. But adults sometimes forgot when they were stressed or angry or influenced by prejudiced ideas about people who looked different from themselves. These discussions required Patricia to explain complex concepts about racism and privilege in language that an elementary school student could understand, a process that deepened her own comprehension of how discrimination operated and why it was harmful regardless of the perpetrator's intentions or awareness. Working with employment discrimination victims through a legal aid organization provided Patricia with opportunities to understand the long-term professional and psychological consequences of workplace bias that extended far beyond the immediate incidents that brought people to seek legal assistance. The stories she heard about promotion denials, hostile work environments, and wrongful termination based on racial or ethnic bias illustrated the cumulative impact of individual prejudiced decisions on families and communities that depended on fair treatment in hiring and advancement processes that were often compromised by conscious and unconscious bias. The educational component of Patricia's accountability work involved taking college-level courses in African American history, civil rights law, and social psychology that filled enormous gaps in her understanding of the historical and contemporary context for the discrimination that she had participated in through her individual actions and social attitudes. The academic study helped her recognize that her airport behavior was part of larger patterns of exclusion and marginalization that had deep roots in American society and required intentional intervention and education to address effectively. Patricia's financial contributions to civil rights organizations represented a significant sacrifice given her limited income. But she understood that meaningful accountability required more than verbal apologies and required supporting institutions that worked to combat the kind of discrimination that she had perpetrated through her viral moment and her lifetime of privileged attitudes toward people who didn't share her racial identity and social advantages. The restorative justice session took place 18 months after the airplane incident in a conference room at the federal courthouse in Manhattan, where Dr. Washington maintained her chambers and conducted the judicial business that had been temporarily disrupted by the harassment and security concerns that followed Patricia's viral meltdown. The facilitator, Maria Santos, had extensive experience in mediating conversations between people who had caused harm and those who had been victimized, but she understood that this particular dialogue carried additional complexity because of the public nature of the original incident and the ongoing legal and social consequences that continued affecting both participants in different ways. Patricia arrived early and spent time reviewing the accountability letter that she had sent months earlier, along with documentation of her volunteer work, educational activities, and speaking engagements that demonstrated her commitment to understanding racism and working to combat discrimination in ways that extended beyond her personal transformation. The preparation had been intensive and emotionally exhausting because it required her to maintain focus on Dr. Washington's experience and perspective rather than her own suffering and loss, a discipline that challenged her lifelong habit of centering her own comfort and needs in conversations about conflict and harm. Dr. Washington entered the conference room with the composed dignity that had characterized her response to Patricia's original attack, carrying a folder that contained the hate mail, death threats, and social media harassment that had targeted her and her family for months after the viral video had exposed their identities and personal information to internet trolls who used racism and misogyny to attack successful black women in public positions. The documentation served as a reminder that Patricia's airport tantrum had triggered consequences that extended far beyond the original participants and had created ongoing safety and privacy concerns for people who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. Mrs. Whitmore, Doctor. Washington began, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that she maintained in professional settings where personal emotions needed to be managed carefully to ensure productive communication. I appreciate your willingness to participate in this process and the accountability work that you have undertaken over the past year and a half, though I want to be clear that my participation today is motivated by my commitment to restorative justice principles, rather than personal forgiveness or reconciliation. Patricia nodded, understanding that the conversation was taking place on Dr. Washington's terms, and that her role was to listen, learn, and accept responsibility, rather than seek absolution or emotional comfort that would prioritize her needs over those of the person she had harmed through her discriminatory behavior. The distinction between accountability and forgiveness was crucial, because it allowed the dialogue to focus on understanding impact and preventing future harm, rather than managing Patricia's guilt or Dr. Washington's trauma in ways that would compromise the educational and healing potential of their exchange. The discussion of Emma's experience revealed the collateral damage that Patricia's behavior had caused to a child who had been excited about traveling with her aunt, but instead witnessed adult racism that required extensive conversation and counseling to process appropriately. Dr. Washington described Emma's questions about why the angry woman had wanted her to move to the back of the airplane, and the challenge of explaining prejudice and discrimination to someone whose young mind was trying to understand why adults would treat each other cruelly based on skin color or perceived differences in social status. Patricia's response focused on accepting responsibility for traumatizing Emma without offering excuses or justifications that would minimize the harm that had been caused to a child who should have been protected from adult prejudice, rather than forced to witness and process racist behavior that violated everything she had been taught about treating people fairly and kindly regardless of their appearance or background. The acknowledgement of harm to Emma was particularly difficult, because it required Patricia to confront the intergenerational impact of racism and the ways that individual discriminatory acts could affect children's developing understanding of their place in the world and their right to feel safe and valued in public spaces. The conversation about ongoing harassment and security concerns revealed the lasting impact of social media exposure on Dr. Washington's professional and personal life as she described the additional security measures that had become necessary to protect her family from people who had used Patricia's viral video as justification for escalating threats and invasive behavior that continued long after the original incident had faded from public attention. The recognition that Patricia's live stream had exposed Dr. Washington to ongoing victimization created a level of responsibility that extended far beyond the original airport interaction and required ongoing vigilance and support to address effectively. Dr. Washington concluded the session by acknowledging Patricia's accountability work, while making clear that genuine transformation required sustained commitment to anti-racism education and activism that would continue for years beyond their conversation. Because understanding discrimination and working to combat it was a lifelong process rather than a temporary response to public embarrassment or legal consequences. The challenge for Patricia was to maintain her commitment to growth and service, even when public attention faded and social pressure to demonstrate change diminished over time. Dr. Washington's nomination to the Supreme Court provided her with a platform to address the broader implications of discriminatory behavior in transportation, hospitality, and other public accommodations that served diverse populations, but often failed to provide equal treatment and dignity to all customers, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or perceived social status. Her confirmation hearings included detailed discussion of implicit bias in customer service, the role of corporate policies in either preventing or enabling discrimination, and the need for industry-wide training programs that would help employees recognize and interrupt prejudiced behavior before it escalated into viral incidents that damaged both individuals and institutional reputations. The Federal Aviation Administration implemented new guidelines for addressing passenger conflicts that involved allegations of discrimination, requiring airlines to document incidents thoroughly and provide training for crew members that focused specifically on recognizing racial bias and responding appropriately to situations where passengers' presence or behavior was challenged based on appearance rather than legitimate safety or security concerns. The new protocols included mandatory reporting of discrimination complaints and regular auditing of airline practices to ensure compliance with federal civil rights laws that prohibited unequal treatment in interstate commerce and public transportation. Patricia's testimony before congressional committees examining discrimination in transportation provided legislators with first-hand insight into the thought processes and social pressures that enabled privileged individuals to justify treating fellow citizens differently based on racist assumptions about their worth and belonging. Her detailed account of the internal rationalization that had preceded her viral meltdown helped lawmakers understand the need for educational interventions that addressed implicit bias before it manifested in discriminatory behavior that violated civil rights and created hostile environments for minority travelers. The airline industry's response to increased federal oversight included comprehensive diversity and inclusion training for all customer-facing employees, with particular emphasis on recognizing the difference between legitimate security concerns and prejudiced assumptions about passengers who didn't conform to stereotypical expectations about first-class travelers or premium service customers. The training programs incorporated Patricia's story as a case study in how individual bias could escalate into public relations disasters that damaged corporate reputation and exposed companies to legal liability under federal discrimination statutes. Robert's early release from federal prison was contingent on his participation in financial crimes education programs that helped other white-collar offenders understand the connection between personal greed and broader patterns of economic inequality that were reinforced through tax evasion, insider trading, and other forms of financial misconduct that concentrated wealth among privileged individuals at the expense of public resources and economic opportunity for working families in marginalized communities. Ashley's decision to pursue law school and specialize in civil rights advocacy represented her attempt to restore honor to the family name through service to communities that had been harmed by discrimination and prejudice, because she understood that her mother's viral moment had damaged not just her own reputation, but the broader struggle for racial equality and social justice that required sustained commitment from people who benefited from privilege and wanted to use their advantages to create positive change rather than perpetuate existing inequalities. The legal precedent established through Dr. Washington's subsequent Supreme Court decisions provided stronger protections for individuals who faced discrimination in public accommodations, employment, housing, and other areas where federal civil rights laws required equal treatment, but were often undermined by subtle forms of bias that were difficult to prove or address through traditional legal remedies. Her jurisprudence emphasized the cumulative impact of individual discriminatory acts and the need for institutional changes that addressed patterns of exclusion rather than just isolated incidents of obvious prejudice. Patricia's work with corporate diversity training programs expanded to include financial services, healthcare education, and other industries where customer service interactions provided opportunities for discriminatory treatment that violated both legal requirements and basic principles of human dignity that should have governed professional relationships regardless of racial identity or socioeconomic status. 3 years after Flight 847 landed at Heathrow, The transformation of both participants in the viral incident had created measurable changes in how institutions and individuals approached issues of race privilege and accountability in ways that extended far beyond their personal growth and professional development. Patricia's speaking engagements had evolved from awkward attempts at public penance into sophisticated presentations about implicit bias and the process of recognizing and changing discriminatory attitudes that had been shaped by lifetime exposure to racist ideas and privileged social positions that insulated people from understanding the impact of their behavior on others. The corporate audiences that initially received Patricia with skepticism and hostility gradually developed respect for her commitment to sustained accountability work that went beyond surface-level apologies and included genuine education about the historical and contemporary context for discrimination that helped explain why individual prejudiced acts were part of larger patterns of exclusion and marginalization that required intentional intervention to address effectively. Emma Washington, now 11 years old and increasingly articulate about issues of fairness and justice, had begun speaking to elementary school audiences about the importance of treating all people with kindness and respect, regardless of their appearance or background. Because her experience witnessing adult racism and subsequent healing through restorative justice had provided her with insights about forgiveness and accountability that impressed educators and child development specialists who recognized her mature understanding of complex social issues. The relationship between Patricia and Emma represented one of the most remarkable outcomes of the restorative justice process, as their supervised interactions had evolved into genuine friendship that challenged both participants to grow in ways that wouldn't have been possible without the structured dialogue that had allowed them to move beyond the trauma of their first encounter and develop mutual understanding based on shared commitment to preventing similar incidents from affecting other children and families. Patricia's financial recovery had been slow and limited because of restitution requirements and employment challenges related to her criminal record and viral notoriety, but she had achieved a modest level of stability that allowed her to maintain decent housing and transportation while continuing her volunteer work and educational activities that provided meaning and purpose that had been absent from her previous life of conspicuous consumption and social competition. The annual Civil Rights Conference, where Dr. Washington delivered keynote speeches about judicial approaches to discrimination, had begun, including Patricia as a workshop facilitator who shared her perspective on the process of confronting and changing racist attitudes, because her transformation provided hope and practical guidance for other people who recognized prejudiced patterns in their own thinking and wanted to develop more inclusive and equitable approaches to interacting with diverse communities. Ashley Whitmore's law school performance and internship work with civil rights organizations had demonstrated her commitment to using legal education to advocate for communities that faced discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations, because she understood that her family's legacy of harm could only be addressed through sustained service to people who continued experiencing the kind of treatment that her mother had inflicted on Dr. Washington and countless other victims of prejudice and entitlement. The documentary film about the airplane incident and its aftermath had become required viewing in business schools and corporate training programs that addressed customer service diversity and crisis management, because the story illustrated both the devastating consequences of viral discrimination and the possibility of meaningful change when people chose accountability over defensiveness and education over denial. Robert's work as a public defender represented his attempt to provide legal services to people who couldn't afford private representation and often faced discrimination within the criminal justice process that favored wealthy defendants who could purchase experienced attorneys and favorable treatment from judges and prosecutors who were influenced by class bias and racial prejudice that affected sentencing and plea bargain negotiations. 5 years after her viral meltdown destroyed everything she had once valued, Patricia found herself boarding another airplane for a cross-country flight to attend a diversity conference where she would share her story with human resources professionals who were responsible for creating inclusive workplace environments that prevented discrimination and bias from affecting hiring, promotion, and employee relations decisions that could impact thousands of workers and their families. The economy class seat that she occupied represented not just her reduced financial circumstances, but her transformed understanding of what truly mattered in air travel and human interaction, because the window view and premium amenities that had once seemed essential to her comfort and status now appeared irrelevant compared to the opportunity to travel safely and efficiently while treating fellow passengers and airline employees with the basic courtesy and respect that should characterize all human relationships regardless of social position or economic advantages. The young black mother struggling with multiple carry-on bags and a fussy toddler in the seat across the aisle provided Patricia with an opportunity to offer assistance without expectation of recognition or gratitude, because her accountability work had taught her that genuine service was motivated by empathy and solidarity, rather than social obligation or self-serving desires to appear helpful while actually maintaining emotional distance from people whose struggles she didn't want to understand or share. The flight attendant who recognized Patricia from her viral video chose to treat her with professional courtesy rather than hostility or judgment, demonstrating the kind of grace under pressure that Patricia had failed to show toward Dr. Washington during their original encounter, and illustrating how individual choices about responding to conflict could either escalate tension or create opportunities for understanding and de-escalation that benefited everyone involved in difficult situations. Patricia's quiet satisfaction in helping the overwhelmed mother organize her belongings and entertain her child during the flight represented the kind of meaningful human connection that she had been incapable of recognizing or valuing during her years of privilege and entitlement, when her interactions with other people had been filtered through calculations about social status and personal advantage rather than simple recognition of shared humanity and mutual vulnerability. The absence of cameras, social media attention, or public recognition for her small acts of kindness confirmed that Patricia's transformation was genuine rather than performative, because authentic change was reflected in private behavior and spontaneous responses to opportunities for service, rather than calculated gestures designed to improve public image or demonstrate moral progress to audiences who might provide social or professional benefits in return for evidence of personal growth. The airplane that had once represented Patricia's domain of privilege and exclusion had become a shared space where people from diverse backgrounds traveled together with mutual consideration and respect for each other's comfort and dignity. Because her understanding of first-class treatment now focused on how people treated each other, rather than what amenities or services they could purchase to distinguish themselves from fellow human beings who deserved equal consideration, regardless of their economic circumstances. The view from her economy window seat reminded Patricia that perspective was a choice that could be cultivated through practice and reflection, rather than purchased through premium pricing or exclusive access, because the same sky and landscape were visible to all passengers, regardless of where they sat or how much they had paid for the privilege of traveling from one place to another in the company of strangers who shared common destinations and human experiences that connected them despite apparent differences in background or social position. Dr. Washington's tenure on the Supreme Court had begun to reshape federal jurisprudence regarding discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and educational institutions through decisions that recognized both the persistent impact of historical racism and the ongoing need for legal remedies that addressed subtle forms of bias that were often difficult to prove, but caused significant harm to individuals and communities that faced cumulative disadvantages in multiple areas of public life. Her judicial philosophy emphasized the connection between individual incidents of discrimination and broader patterns of institutional behavior that required comprehensive intervention rather than case-by-case remedies that failed to address root causes of unequal treatment in education. housing, health care, and other essential services that affected quality of life and economic opportunity for millions of Americans who faced barriers based on race, ethnicity, gender, and other characteristics that should not have influenced their access to equal treatment under law. Patricia's diversity training programs had expanded into a consulting practice that helped corporations, educational institutions, and nonprofit organizations develop policies and procedures that prevented discriminatory behavior while creating inclusive environments where all employees and customers could participate fully without facing bias or prejudice that compromised their dignity and equal treatment. The business case studies that incorporated Patricia's story demonstrated both the financial risks of discrimination and the economic benefits of inclusive practices that attracted diverse customers and employees who contributed different perspectives and experiences that enhanced innovation and problem-solving capabilities in organizations that valued diversity as a competitive advantage rather than a legal obligation or moral burden. Emma Washington's decision to pursue legal education had been inspired by her observations of both her aunt's judicial career and Patricia's accountability work, because she understood that lasting change required people from different backgrounds and experiences to work together in addressing discrimination and creating institutions that honored the dignity and potential of all people, regardless of their identity or circumstances. The annual scholarship program, established in memory of the airplane incident, provided educational opportunities for students from underrepresented backgrounds who were interested in careers in law, business education, and other fields where diverse leadership could help create more equitable and inclusive organizations that served the needs of increasingly diverse communities and customer bases. Robert's re-entry into legal practice as a public defender had reconnected him with the idealistic motivations that had originally drawn him to law school, but had been compromised by decades of prioritizing financial gain over public service and social justice that required personal sacrifice and commitment to clients who couldn't provide the monetary rewards that had previously motivated his career choices and professional relationships. The documentary about transformation and accountability had become a teaching tool in law schools, business schools, and diversity training programs that needed concrete examples of how individual change was possible when people chose education over denial and service over self-protection, because the story provided hope for institutions and communities that were struggling to address discrimination and bias that seemed intractable without models for successful intervention and personal growth. Ashley's civil rights practice had developed a specialty in social media discrimination cases that helped victims of viral harassment seek legal remedies and institutional changes that prevented online platforms from being used to amplify and perpetuate discriminatory behavior that targeted individuals and communities based on race, ethnicity, religion, and other protected characteristics that should not have made people vulnerable to mass harassment and abuse. The airline industry's adoption of bias training and discrimination reporting protocols had created measurable improvements in customer satisfaction and employee confidence in handling conflicts that involved allegations of unequal treatment, because clear policies and procedures provided staff with tools and support for recognizing and interrupting discriminatory behavior before it escalated into incidents that damaged both individual dignity and corporate reputation. The first-class cabin of a modern airliner represents the pinnacle of commercial aviation luxury, where passengers expect and receive treatment that justifies the premium prices they pay for enhanced comfort, privacy, and service that distinguishes their travel experience from the more basic accommodations available in economy sections. But the true measure of first-class service isn't found in the thread count of the linens or the vintage of the wine being served with dinner. It's reflected in how every passenger is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or any other characteristic that prejudiced minds might use to question their right to occupy seats they have legitimately purchased. The story of Patricia Whitmore and Dr. Amelia Washington reminds us that transformation is possible when people choose accountability over defensiveness, education over ignorance, and service over self-protection. because human beings have the capacity to recognize their mistakes, understand the harm they have caused, and commit to lifelong growth that honors the dignity of everyone they encounter. The process of changing deeply embedded attitudes and behaviors requires sustained effort and willingness to accept uncomfortable truths about privilege, prejudice, and the ways that individual actions contribute to larger patterns of discrimination that affect entire communities and generations of families who deserve better than the treatment they have historically received. The institutional changes that emerged from their viral encounter demonstrate that individual incidents of discrimination can become catalysts for broader social transformation when people refuse to accept unequal treatment as normal or inevitable, because every moment of injustice contains the potential for education, accountability, and systemic reform that benefits not just the immediate participants, but countless others who face similar challenges in their daily interactions with institutions and individuals who have the power to either recognize their humanity or deny their equal worth and dignity. If this story has moved you to examine your own assumptions and behaviors, please like this video to help us reach more people with this important message about the power of transformation and the possibility of redemption through accountability and service. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things in their commitment to creating a more just and equitable world where everyone can participate fully without having their presence questioned or their dignity challenged by strangers who mistake temporary advantages for permanent superiority. Share this video with friends, family members, and colleagues who might benefit from understanding how individual choices about treating others can either perpetuate discrimination or contribute to healing that extends far beyond the original participants to benefit entire communities and future generations, who deserve to inherit a world where basic human respect is not negotiable or conditional on meeting other people's expectations about appropriate appearance or behavior. Remember that every interaction is an opportunity to choose dignity over prejudice, understanding over judgment, and transformation over stagnation, because the character of our communities and institutions is determined not by the mistakes that people make, but by how they respond when confronted with evidence of harm they have caused and opportunities to grow beyond the limitations of their previous understanding and experience.